welcome everybody to this, I think it's the 15th Futures of Design Education meetup.
Hello, ma'am. ये generator चालू कर दो ना. और
if I could ask everybody to mute, that would be really greatly appreciated. Cool, thank you, Prabhu. Yeah, so thank you. Welcome to the 15th meetup. I should have set that properties in the meeting. That was my fault. We have today Ishan Khosla, who's going to be talking about typecraft in a particular context and a particular setting. So really looking forward to that today. Just as I said earlier, the next presenter will be Luciana Scruchin. She's going to be on the 15th of May at about the same time, 12 o'clock BST. Luciana's from Parsons New School in New York. I'm hoping that she's going to be, we haven't confirmed the topic yet. I'm hoping she's going to be talking a bit about cross-disciplinary student spaces and experiences. She has quite an interesting approach to, if you like, where design education might take place. So that should be a good discussion next month. But as I say, what we're doing today is we're here to hear about Ishan Khosla's work. So I think maybe actually, I'll maybe just allow yourself to introduce yourself, Ishan. If I can just say though, before Ishan takes over, Ishan is up a mountain somewhere in northern India. There is a storm coming over from Tibet. So we already have some technical issues with the connection. So if everybody can be a bit patient with the connection, that'll be absolutely brilliant. We do have a backup plan. It's a bit of a sellotape, masking tape backup plan. And as I say, if people could be kind of patient with the connection, that'll be greatly appreciated. So Ishan, I think I'll hand over to you if that's okay.
Hi, Derek. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear. Oh, Ishan, you might have muted yourself again.
Yeah, I just muted myself till I get a confirmation. Thank you. Thank you, Derek, for having me here. And I hope you all can hear me. I'll try to speak softly. I mean, slowly rather, not softly. And, you know, thank you to you and Leslie and DRS for having me over. And I apologize that I'm in a remote area and I hope the connection holds. I'm just going to share my presentation. Do let me know if you can see it. Yeah, okay.
That was good.
Great. Thanks. So my name is Ishan Khosla, and I'm a visual artist and designer, as well as an educator based in India, in the mountainous region of Dehradun, where I teach at UPES. And I'm also a partner at the Typecraft Initiative. And today I will be talking about the importance of indigenous craft and knowledge systems in a decolonized design education curriculum. So I'll just talk about that. And I might request Derek to give me a thumbs up and then I'll move. Yeah, great. So as far as the introduction, I just wanted to is not just for designers, but it's for craftspeople as well. It's for people who are so-called non-designers as well. So I think we have to broaden the view of what is design education and who is it for today. So Derek, it's all good. Should we move on to the next one? Great, thanks. Sorry for that. I have to just make sure that everything's clear. So I'll start by just, for those of you who are may or may not be familiar, just talking about how contemporary design came to India. And so the birth in quotations of design in India, as we know, of course, design is, you know, in some sense, thousands of years old, of course. But the way we see design today in the contemporary rubric is something that came to India through modernism, through our first prime minister post-independence, Nehru, who you see on the left next to Corbusier. So he brought in a lot of, you know, people from the West, architects, experts, designers, leaders in the field, Buckminster Fuller, Eames, you can see Eames on the right, to set up design centers like NID and build cities. So there was a big focus on modernist design in India at that time. And of course, at that time, there was no other real prevailing system of design pedagogy and practice. So I guess it was felt necessary to import this idea of design, from the West at that time. All good for the next slide?
Yeah, and please feel free to just keep going, Ishan. I'll give you a shout if anything looks a bit odd.
Okay,
yeah, cool.
Great, got it. Thank you. So so however, for much of the previous century and even till today, modernism has kind of imposed its Eurocentric principles to the world of design. The adoption of a more minimal and barren aesthetic aimed at banishing the lushness of ornament, which in Europe was associated with the excesses of the bourgeoisie, has had a kind of a numbing effect on a country such as India. And Alice Twemlow, in her article in iMagazine on the decriminalization of ornament, talks about the fact that modernism removed any sort of meaning and function from ornament. And in fact, in effect, it made it appear to be obsolete. And here we're talking about two types of function. One is the more utilitarian function that modernism is focused on. And I'll talk later about the more social aspect of function, what that means, and I'll in a few slides later. According to Kenya Hara, of course, the famous Japanese designer behind the Muji brand, ornament is power. The fact does remain that prior to the Industrial Revolution, ornament has had an important function in all societies. Decoration and intricacy is not only a mark of workmanship and skill developed over centuries, but it is also symbolic of identity, power, and it's tantamount to abundance, beauty, and vibrancy. Just go to the next one. Yeah. So ornament in South Asia has the core function to organize society. I mean, not only in South Asia, it's all over, but like currently, since I'm talking about South Asian design, it has the core function to basically functionalism, which is addressed by the modernists. Here we're talking about how ornament can actually basically give identity to different groups of people, right, through their clothing or tattoos or other sorts of ways in which they identify themselves as a community. So which I call like the social function of ornament. Of course, there's a clash in ideologies between the largely Western definition of design, which espouse precision, uniformity, consistency, and legibility, versus the more traditional, if you want to call it that, definitions which are pre-industrialized, which are based on pre-industrialized craft-based design, which is about intricacy, irregularity, and the eccentricity of the handmade. So the idea of legibility is an interesting metaphor in terms of the nuanced layers and complex history of local communities, their identities and crafts being transformed into a digital typeface. So in addition, there's a poignant association of letters to literacy, which have associations of power and control by the dominant group over others. For legibility, it's not only about something being like a typeface being legible, but it's also about who is it legible to, or who, and so that raises other questions, and also questions about literacy. Why are certain groups literate and other groups not so literate? Is it just lack of access, or is there something more beyond what one sees in front of us? Usually it's not what you just see in front of your eyes. There's a deeper meaning and politics behind that as well. I won't get into that right now. But interestingly, graphic design itself started out as a craft-based profession, with punch cutters, letter presses, binderies, and foundries. Subconsciously combining type and craft has always been a part of graphic design history. So right now I'm just making a case for Typecraft. I'm going to talk about what is Typecraft in the next few slides, but I'm just trying to explain to you how deviant it is from the modernist ideas of precision and minimalism. It's kind of bringing in, Indian cultural aspect into the fray. So I would say the Indian minds today, so the importation of Bauhausian and Swiss independence has straitjacketed its design sensibility, which couldn't be further away from the exuberance and the creative spontaneity that one sees on the streets and the villages of India. So India is anything but sparse and minimal. The Indian instinct is to be expressive. So, whether it's bridal trousseaus or tattoos or truck art, we see, Indians or South Asians have an innate love for the ornate and the idea of self-expression. So India is not a less is more country. As you can see, it's layered, nuanced, and it's a complex patchwork of ideologies, belief systems, and cultures. So this slide will not play because it's a PDF, but it just says the Typecraft Initiative, which was established in 2012 with the aim to create, greater exchange between urban designers and rural craftspeople. And on one hand, it allows designers to work with the rich crafts of South Asia, and on the other, it allows artisans and craftspeople to try out new ways to represent their craft that suit new audiences, contexts, and mediums. And this slide on type, identity, and people is about the relationship between, identity, the community. Was there someone saying something? Derek, you there?
No, it's okay. Keep crack on. That was my fault.
Right.
I need to mute someone. It's okay.
No problem. So basically, the slide is about the connection between identity of a community, type, TYPE, which is the binding element, and people itself. The idea of, how do we bring all of these things together through typography? And really, it is about embedding motifs, patterns, symbolisms, and symbols that are important to a relevant group into a typeface. What you see here are women from the western part of India in the desert area called Barmer. And these are, I will talk more about this later, but these are basically called Barmer Katab, or it's a patchwork type of process of making designs made into letter forms. Okay. The core ethos of Typecraft is diversity, something that is under attack, not just today, but throughout history. Diversity in terms of, working with disparate groups of people, but also in terms of myriad meanings that these crafts hold in the memory. So modernist construct of form follows function, where function is devoid and relegated to the idea of utilitarianism, goes contrary to what we're trying to do. In our case, the social and cultural values are part of the core function of the craft and the identity of the typeface. So now I'm actually going to get into I'm going to talk about 4 axes or 4 areas in which design, education, and can intersect with Typecraft, or how can Typecraft be used in different ways for what I call design education, and we'll talk about that. As I said, design education is not just for designers. So axis 1 is craftspeople. And so the idea is about circular knowledge and how, on one hand, we benefit from our exchanges with craftspeople in many ways, and I'll talk about that later. But the idea here is, how do crafts entire tribal communities benefit from their exchange with design and designers? And the idea is really, to look at things like design methodology workshops that we've started, which introduces design thinking and basically working in a very free and experimental way to crafts used to, in many cases, unfortunately, they've given a design and they're just made to implement it. So here we're trying to make them authors, not make them, but encourage them to be authors themselves rather than be told to make a certain design. So each workshop is tailor-made for a craft based on its materiality, process, and we use cheap and easy to manipulate materials such as paper. And here you can see Bhami Devi, a Barmer patchwork and applique craftswoman, creating various designs in paper. The process can be fairly challenging because some of these women have never been allowed to work with their hands. They just, in terms of experimenting on design, they've just, as I said, given a piece of cloth and asked to stitch or fold or, more implementation work. But how do you go about creating a design from scratch can be intimidating for anyone, a designer or a craftsperson. But that's something we try to imbibe. And this is a part of the process where designers are also involved, including students, into how do we make it easier for people to get started designing new designs and thinking in new ways. Basically design thinking, as I said. So over time, we were amazed to see how some of these women who are illiterate, this was a 2-week workshop, but they could start making letter forms. And they experimented a lot, and some of them were very advanced and started designing the entire alphabet using paper cuts, so that was great. And how they took it onto cloth. And then finally, these were also used as part of the typeface that we have today. The process, of course, varies depending on the craft. Here you see another craft called Soof embroidery, which is made up of triangles. And so the process of working with these women would be slightly different in terms of we call it a design kit or a toolkit. So we give them like these building blocks. So here it's all based on triangles and parallelograms because that's what the embroidery is based on. These women are not so used to drawing. And so our design methodology workshops or these design thinking workshops have to be tailor-made for each group. And so here you can see some of the craftswomen are actually playing around with papers, just cutouts and making different, forms, letter forms, which they told us was a lot of fun because they've never done this before, to try different shapes. And it's quick. It's something, they're not afraid of failing at because there's no material cost. You can always use more paper, whereas cloth and other materials or processes like embroidery can be quite time consuming or expensive. So this is one of the areas that we're kind of looking into, and how do design students or even faculty create these different kits for different types of groups that one can work with. And letters is one avenue. We can even look at other avenues, of course. So access to, and before I proceed, how am I doing with time, Derek?
Time's relative, Ishan. If it's interesting, I would keep going. You're probably about maybe 15 minutes. It's up to yourself whether you wanted to go through a part or skip forward, skip back. I know I've got loads of interesting questions already, but entirely up to yourself. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think I should be done in 7 or 8 minutes. I'm more than halfway done. Great. So access to is about designers, and of course, designers can be design students as well. So how do we bring this into the design school curriculum in a more direct way? So designers and students not only learn from local contexts, apply research methodologies, but also understand how to translate local knowledge systems into a contemporary functional design language. What I mean here is that can you take, this is something that any designer is trained to do in any case, right? Like take a visual language, it could be anything,
it could be a camouflage, and deconstruct it, break it down into its building blocks, and then reconstruct it into a new form. Because that's what we're really doing with Typecraft, right? We're taking a pattern or a motif or a system, a language of patterns or a language of tattoos, and we're deconstructing what that language consists of, and then ideally with collaboration rather than us doing it. We try to collaborate as much as possible, but we are in a way I guess driving that. So as designers, in any case, we do this all the time. So can this be something that can be introduced in terms of a curriculum or a course, and what does it mean? The other aspect is that we are trained to research, document, gather information, and then represent and analyze that data. And this can be used for analyzing anything from the spread of COVID to tribal tattoos. So there are numerous communities in India which are disappearing in front of our eyes. So this community, the Gond community, the tribe, whom we made a typeface from. In fact, the font that you see here, designers, is made from tattoos. But they're basically vanishing in terms of they're merging into mainstream society, and they're basically, a lot of them, including a lot of these communities, are not continuing their traditional way of working. So they don't do tattoos anymore, or some communities don't do embroideries anymore. So this information, which is, I think it's very important, not only anthropologically and culturally, but also from a design point of view, and it's not been really looked at, is something that design education could also get involved with. Another aspect which we've already, of course, tried out even in the UK, this is in the University of Edinburgh a few years back, where I know all the students, they are mainly Chinese here, but this is at the University of Edinburgh, interestingly. 90% of the students, when we were this class at least. So the other thing is that how do we now teach this in college, design and curriculum? As I said, this idea of deconstructing and then reconstructing. So this is kind of a correlate earlier, like I showed in this slide. I don't know if you see the slide with the women working on the letters. Yeah. So here the women are, what they're doing is they know their craft really well and the forms, but they're now creating letter forms, which they're not that familiar with. And here we have designers and design students who are more familiar with typography and type design, but they're not familiar with that, with the culture, with the local culture. So one is, of course, sensitivity to that culture and understanding that culture, but the other is how do we also, interact with their visual language and systems. This is in India as well. Some similar classes have happened in the past. And also one of the things I ask students to do is to create a kit each time when they work with a new community. What is the most efficient way of breaking down their knowledge system in visual terms, which can then be used to construct new forms. So it doesn't have to be type. Type is just one avenue, as I said before. So this is the second axis, basically, of working in a more direct way with design students and design schools. Axis 3 will look at literacy, because obviously we're dealing with type and we're dealing with language in a way, right? So we are creating letter forms, and there's still a large illiterate population in India, sadly, and even a lot of the women who we work with and their children are not literate, and we hope that one day the children can learn the language, whether it's English or it could be a local language, through the crafts that their mothers are making. So that would be quite a nice thing to do. We've started to do that already, but these are really baby steps. And so the idea, so letters and type are very important from various perspectives. Firstly, since letters are decontextualized from the motifs and patterns the craftswomen are used to working with, it challenges them in new ways, right? So if we were to ask a craftswoman who's already making peacock motifs or a tree motif or a flower motif to make the same motifs in a different form, it's a different challenge. But if you ask them to make something totally alien to them, like a letter, like a font, well, not a font, but a letter form, that's like really taxes the mind, right? Challenges them quite a bit. It would challenge anyone. So from that perspective, letters can be very interesting and important as a starting point. The other, of course, is the idea of illiteracy and how many women, while doing these workshops, picked up the language, picked up a few words at least, could spell their name, right? So, I mean, this is just baby steps, but we want to see, can this become bigger, and can it even be part of curriculum to work in the villages? So not only to make a font, but how do we also get involved in literacy? And I'll talk about that in a minute, really briefly. So Typecraft is not just about font design. Of course, we started Typecraft, as I said, to interact with people from various communities. Being from an urban area, how do I interact with people in villages as a graphic designer? Type seemed to be the most, I guess, instinctive way I started this. But of course now, you know, it touches on many other aspects, as social and political and other aspects that can be talked about, as you've been listening to. And of course, literacy is a major aspect. And here we are working with children in rural Bihar. I visited here in January as well, where we are working on a typeface based on a local folk art called Mithila, and how, you know, I'll talk about it in the next slide, how that can be translated into these sort of ideograms where you have images and text embedded into each other. This is, of course, an exercise that students are doing, children are doing. So this is design thinking at the school level now, like not the design school level, obviously, but at the primary school, where children are now thinking of creating letter forms with images embedded in it. And in a way, this kind of harks back at how language itself started, as we know that, you know, the language letter forms did start from images. And so there's this interesting connection we already have, but we've kind of lost over time. Of course, we do use emoticons and all that stuff every day, but I don't know if we make this connection all the time. But the other idea is that, can we actually take this further and make it into a learning app, which addresses rural communities in their own languages, you know, employing local crafts that emphasize folklore, mythology, and bring that into contextual education. So far, education has been very decontextualized and centralized. How do we bring it back to a local context? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we are basically, you know, working on Devanagari or a Hindi typeface using these forms that you've seen before, but this is eventually going to become a font. So it's quite a daunting task. The other thing we're doing is we're creating a children's book based on ideograms, where, again, working with these craft forms, combining you know, images and letters. So these are all spelling different things, but they also say the same thing. And lastly, we've introduced this, we've kind of completed the circle. So, you know, these are the women who are doing the paper cuts you saw earlier, and with whom we made the typeface. And then after the typeface was made, we went back to the same women and said, can you make some quilts based on your own typefaces, which we can do, you know, to schools and do a large scale Scrabble kind of thing, right? So it's a quilt, but it can also, you can create letter forms, and I mean, you can create words horizontally and vertically, just like you would do in Scrabble, and learn about colors and other things as well. In the interest of time, I won't get into it, but basically this is another application, you know, where design thinking and design knowledge can be brought in. So it's not necessarily that design, you know, design curriculum is only for design students. It can, as I said, you know, it can be for primary school students, it can be for craftswomen, etc. And I would go to the last section where I'm talking about the design and design education has, in a way, become a slave to industry today. And, you know, it can act as a powerful weapon to speak out against social injustices, I should say. And in the sense, working with local indigenous tribal communities, it can make a statement, you know, if the designer really wants to push that agenda. And I think that's important to bring into the classroom and sensitize students on what's going on actually with a lot of these communities. There is a battle between the handmade and the industrial, and it's playing out all over the world. It was in America, it was in Australia, and you see it in India with the tribal communities, their land being taken up by industry and highways, etc. So there's a lot of strife. And since we are working on Typecraft, can we do something along these lines? And again, I'm going back to the idea of pictograms for a second, which is obviously the earliest form of proto-language and expressed only through images. And then of course we went on, from icons, and we eventually got into language. So, this transformation of the symbol to the alphabet marked a significant change in our ethos and allowed us a large vocabulary that symbols alone could not convey. But however, when we translate a tribal or a craft motif into a typeface, the original context of the motifs and the designs that are known to the tribal communities are lost in one, in a sense, one form of communication, which is the pictographic and the metaphoric, which is known to a small group, is lost, and it's transformed to another, which is the literal and the textual, like language, the English language or the Latin script or another language, typography, which is known to a broader audience, has come out of it. So that, in a sense, is creating it's kind of contradictory to what we're trying to do here, right? So this is what an important point I wanted to raise. And then, a response to that could be, can we actually, in the case of Typecraft, when we move from images, which is motifs and icons, to text, when we lose this original context and the significance of the icons, the visual really becomes literal. And to counter that, one idea could be to actually re-embed meaning into the motifs itself. I know this doesn't make sense right now. I'll just use it. Done. So future project, which we are planning to start, I mentioned to Derek just now, the beginning, that we are going to start this project with the Warli tribe of Western India. So what you saw in the previous slide, I know these are probably looking very small on your screen, but you can Google it later. It's W-A-R-L-I, Warli. It's one of the oldest iconographies in India. In fact, they found them on cave paintings dating back to the Mesolithic age. So these icons are old, ancient. And so we are planning to work with them. And, they're facing a lot of social injustice in terms of their land being taken, a lot of deforestation happening. And when we create a typeface, what we've done is we've gone to the community and said, what should the typeface talk about? So it's not just about the visual and the superficial, if you want to call it, iconography and the beautiful, intricate, designs that we've been doing so far, but can it actually talk about deforestation, literally or in some other way? So one way would be to actually have, some of these, the motifs and the icons which exist inside a letter show deforestation or whatever they want to talk about, whatever is important to that community. It's kind of like I see it almost like a time capsule. And it represents the contemporary milieu of that community captured in this typeface, which can of course be changed in the future. But right now, what are the contemporary issues? So it also represents the past, obviously, ancestor worship and harvest worship and gods, all of these things that are important to the tribal community is very important to represent in the typeface. But how do you communicate all these to someone sitting in Alaska who doesn't know this community, right? So that's what got me started thinking. And that one way is to literally embed the motifs into the letter forms. But the other idea is, what if you type a word like deforestation and you actually get images or links online? So there would be certain keywords that you would type, or maybe one would have to somehow tell the person that there are these keywords embedded in there, but you may even chance upon it. Some keywords could relate to ancestors or important artists in their community, or it could be about various harvest traditions, because harvest is a major part of their cultural iconography, the depiction of harvest. But the other is that if you type in some words like deforestation, maybe you get images that either talk about it or links to articles that talk about what's been going on in the last few years. So this would be an interesting way where we can actually bring more context through, design and working with the community to the user, rather than just being a visual treat. Let's just call it that for now. So I think that's it for me. I know this is a lot of information, and I apologize for that. I hope it was all very clear, and I'm happy to take questions, comments, criticisms. Thank you.
Fantastic, Ishan. And no need to apologize at all. It was really, really interesting. And I love some of the depth. You've gone into just enough depth in 2 or 3 dimensions that were already quite intriguing to me before I heard you talk. So thank you very much for that. And again, once again, everyone, just so you know, the reason why the presentation was so small in inverted commas, it's so we're trying to really limit the bandwidth, and I've switched video off as well, because as I say, Ishan is up a mountain in northern India awaiting a fantastic storm. I still think though, and I said to this to you before, Ishan, before the presentation, just the visual strength, if you like, of the imagery, I think was just more than enough, that even at that small scale, it really told its own story. And that was, yeah, so thank you very, very, very much indeed. I'm going to open this straight out because I know that other people, I'm sure many other people have far better questions than I could ask. And I know there's quite a few sort of experts in this area as well in the audience. So yeah, I'm just going to throw it straight out. Before I do though, I'd just like to correct something I said earlier. I said that the next Futures meetup was on the 15th. It's actually on the 20th of May. And I say, hopefully that'll be Luciana Scritchen, but it's on the 20th of May, not the 15th. The events are all on Eventbrite. I'll put some links into the chat afterwards. But anyway, can I open it up to anyone who wants to either ask a question of Ishan or make any observations? There must be many questions. Nope, does nobody want to jump in? Okay, in that case, I will go for it then, if that's okay with you, Ishan.
Yes, please go ahead. Thanks, Derek. Yeah.
Cool. I mean, you constantly, I mean, I don't know where we'll go to with this one, Ishan, because what was really interesting was that notion of like richness versus abstraction, the meaning of something. I mean, I love the phrase that you used. What was it, round about the richness, the exuberance of the handmade? It was something like that. Was that the phrase? So is that, if you like, the richness of meaning? Yeah, cool. That's imbued in a thing that is made, as opposed to something that is almost necessarily standardized so it can be recognized in multiple different spaces. And what was really interesting was your discussion about how that sort of relationship between these two things goes. And it was interesting that you didn't present a solution, and you didn't say that you had a solution or a perfect thing. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about your ideas and philosophy behind that. Have you ever found a way to balance those tensions, or is it something that you consciously work with all of the time? Is it something that you encourage in your students, or between the different practices that you do? Or have I gone too far immediately, and do you want me to ask another question?
No, this is it's a great question. Thank you, Derek. It's a fantastic question, because actually it's a conundrum, right? Because we are using technology. We're using a Macintosh computer, we're using software to make these typefaces, which are mass produced in their own sense. And then, but the starting point is something handmade. So it's never going to be, there are a lot of gray areas. It's never going to be black or white. And I think that's part of the beauty of, in a way, the world we live in, even though it's a messy world. But I guess it's always been a messy world, perhaps. But I think, yeah, so I encourage debate, and I encourage gray areas. I don't, illegibility, if you want to call it that. I don't like to conclude, and yeah, I let people draw out their own conclusions, and which is why I left that open-ended. But the thing is that tension does remain in whatever you do, right? So whichever community you work with, you always have that in the back of your mind, that okay, how do I make this not only authentic and meaningful to that community, but also useful, functional in a way to someone, a designer or an artist somewhere, anywhere in the world, but also for that person to be intrigued by this community, for that circle to complete, for them to come back to this community. And but that tension, to come back to your point, between the handmade and the digital is always going to remain. You know, even when we trace the trace the artworks, or because we usually tend to make these artworks by hand, the community makes it by hand, and then they're scanned or traced, and then traced onto the computer. And then even in that tracing, which is although done by the hand using a computer, you know, what is that? Is that handmade, or is that computer done, right? Is it digital? Is it mass produced? So there is always that interesting tension. And I think that's part of the whole, you know, beauty of this.
Yep, I love that way that
project.
I love that way that you said it's absolutely fine to leave these grey things in. I think that's something I think a lot of designers and creative people are absolutely comfortable with, but it can be so difficult sometimes, depending on what sort of educational background you come from. I noticed there's quite a few questions in the chat, so maybe I won't pick up on that one directly. Roshni, I think, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly there, is asking about the best way to work with tribal groups in the most respectful way. Roshni, did you want to come in on that, or is that a fair summary of the question?
No, that's exactly it. I think in India we work, you know, we want, hi Ishan, we're a huge fan. I run local in Bombay and love your work, and you're a huge inspiration. So just, you know, you work so much with you know, with people on the ground and people, all these craftspeople into graphic design. And I'm always a bit nervous working with them, because you don't want to exploit them, but at the same time want to use you know, our graphic design skills to sort of elevate their craft work, you know. So how do you kind of strike that healthy balance?
Thank you, Roshni. Relevant as well. So yeah, it's challenging. And honestly, when I first started doing this, I definitely made a few mistakes, you know, and I think over time I realized the best thing is to be transparent, and just tell people, talk to them what, you know, about what you're doing, and also be open to them rejecting you, like them saying, nah, you know, this is not for me, you know, this project is not for our community. And that can also happen sometimes. So as long as, I think one is as transparent and open and fair, and even in terms of monetary benefits, everything, right? What happens to this project after they make it, when it goes digital? What is the whole, I guess, timeline of, you know, the whole course of the project? Like, how does it move forward? And what are the outcomes, you know? Also, what would be the outcomes or the benefits for that craftsperson or the tribal artist, right? So as long and with the person you're dealing with, I think usually things are pretty sorted. And a lot of times we also work through NGOs, you know, non-governmental organizations that work with craftspeople or tribal organizations. Sometimes we deal with them directly, but sometimes we also go through these channels because they're more used to working with such communities. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Cool. No, I love that. It's almost, there's a lovely mini manifesto in there. It's like, you're going to make mistakes, be transparent, and if people say no, that's okay, respect it. I quite like that. It's quite to the point. You're clearly somebody that's reflected on this. There's another interesting question in the chat. Nice presentation. Can we replace paper with more sustainable items? Deforestation, the upcoming topic, you know, where there's any, it's not just about the font, perhaps, it's maybe about the media or the medium with which that is communicated. I don't know whether you wanted to comment on that one at all, Ishan?
Yeah, I mean, the amount of paper we use is minuscule. I mean, it's not like publish. I mean, even if you publish one book, like 2,000, 3,000 copies, that's probably going to be, any one book is more than the paper we've ever used in all our projects till date. So it's not that we use a lot of paper. So I don't know. Yeah, but good to know.
Yeah, no, definitely, absolutely. And I'm going to pick up again on Catherine Scott's question here in the chat. It does kind of pick up on Roshni's question, which is about appropriation. And again, at a local level, you know, if you're working relatively locally, Ishan, you know, in an Indian context, in Indian design schools, that's one thing. But say, for example, you raised the example of working between Edinburgh and your own context. You know,
Yeah.
does distance have an implication on this? Is it okay to reappropriate when you're at such a remove? It's almost kind of like the typeface thing itself in some way. And Catherine, please jump in if I'm like over asking the question here. It's like the typeface allows you to be one step away from the original thing, but then if we are just then talking about the typeface, it's almost like you're 2 or 3 steps away from the original thing. I suppose the question might be round about the connection to that authenticity, and when it becomes not okay to do that, when it's that there are no balances. Catherine, is that a kind of fair summary, or did you want to ask a particular sort of inflection on that question?
Is my mic working?
It is indeed. Go for
Good.
it.
No, just other different patterns were coming in. You know, I was thinking of sort of indigenous Australian art and Native American art, and how I was just thinking of all the different ways you could develop typefaces using those. And then I thought, well, is it okay? Can we do that? Sure, if maybe I could imagine running a class with a group of kids saying, right, let's actually look at this, but should we actually maybe go back, and I'm in Ireland, should we be maybe looking at symbolism, Irish symbolism only, or is it okay to actually sort of appropriate all the different, you know, that sort of rich symbolism? I just don't know now if we're even allowed to use it. It was just my question. How acceptable is it for people to, you know, draw on that sort of wealth of stuff from other cultures when they're not a part of it? Should we just stick to our own, which sounds a bit insular?
That's a good question, Catherine. Thank you for the question. I would just say that go to the source, right? So even in my own culture, so I'm, you know, like in India, there are, I don't know, about 300 to 400 tribal groups and many artisanal groups. I mean, they're in the millions. There are about 250 craftspeople in India. I don't know how many communities there are, individual communities, but each one is different from me, even though I'm Indian and they're Indian. So even if I was to work with one of their motifs or crafts, I would always go to them and seek their permission or their collaboration, ideally, rather than just taking it. But I understand sometimes you want to do it as in a classroom setting, as an inspiration. It's a tricky question in that situation. I'm not sure. I'm not, in my opinion, in my case, I've never done that. I always go to the source. And, you know, if that is a living craft or art form, of course, if there are no practitioners, then that raises other questions, right? So then I don't know, that's a tough one. But in a case of a living craft or living art form or a tribal art, I would always go to the community and seek their approval. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. Thanks.
Thank you.
And there's an interesting question from Ruth round about accessibility. So she's thinking about the tactile nature of these works. Or Ruth, did you want to ask us a question or talk to this directly?
What I was thinking is I know that blindness and visual impairment is a significant issue in India, especially in poorer communities, and aware that the actual making of these objects looks very tactile and they're very big. So somebody who might not be able to read small text might be able to make a big paper cut A. And I was just wondering if that's something that any of the craftspeople that you collaborated with have experienced. And also whether there's any way of producing the typeface digitally, maybe with 3D printing or something, in a way that would allow that element to be experienced by blind and visually impaired people elsewhere.
Thank you, Ruth. That's a great question. I mean, we haven't yet explored this idea of working with craftspeople and visually impaired people yet, but I think it's a great area to also potentially look into in the future. And I don't know about 3D printing. It ultimately comes down to costs and then who's going to pay for it, unfortunately. But that's definitely an area that one can look into for sure. It makes sense because especially with textile, it's so tactile. The only thing is that a lot of these, the patchworks, although they are, they have a sort of a raised surface, but I don't know, I'm not an expert on visual impairment, but I don't know how effective they are in terms of readability or, how a person with visual impairment could benefit from that. But it's something I think worth exploring for sure.
Definitely. It also sounds, again, Ruth, I'll maybe bow to your sort of greater experience or expertise in this area, but it also sounds as if it's almost like that advocation to go to the source on this. It might be that in different communities, I know certainly in Scotland with some of the weaving and textile making communities, the notion of the physical without sight is actually quite important, and how you create meaning through reading with your body might not necessarily just be about, can you visualize what the image should look like to a sighted person because it's the shape of an A. It might be about the texture of the craft or the texture of the material itself. It could be that different forms of communication maybe exist, but finding those in their contexts might be the more useful thing to do, rather than bringing some other context to ask. Does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah, that's why I was asking if anyone had sort of been specifically involved, like as the craftspeople, because I know quite a lot of craftspeople might have visual. They might not even realise necessarily. Like accessing opticians and accessing glasses is a privilege that a lot of people don't have. My mum's a visually impaired knitter, so that's why I was thinking of it from the creator perspective.
Absolutely. No, I think this would be that'd be a really interesting area of study. It really, really would. Yeah.
No, I think there's a lot in there that can be looked into for sure. I mean, especially in textiles, I would say, because of tactile and the layered nature of it. But thank you for the question. Yeah. Thank you, Ruth. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, well, particularly just in the work that you've been doing, Ishan, the crossover and the similarity is very, very, very marked. I'd like to pick up on one of the things that you did say. There's almost the idea that I think you actually used the phrase that diversity is almost under attack. And I've never heard it phrased in quite such a strong way before. But when you think about it, it's a massive problem. Early on in the presentation, you raised the issue of the modernist movement and how particularly traditional Western and global Northern curricula have had a massive impact on either indigenous, local, or even newer design curriculum emerging in lots of different parts of the world. And India is absolutely, there's a whole bunch of history related to that, very explicitly and specifically, colonial-wise. But that notion of this diversity being under attack, I wonder if are there any signs of, well, not hope. I mean, I do start to see quite a lot of practitioners starting to value this idea of diversity, and not just diversity of existing centric forms or paradigms, but actually deliberately trying to re-recognize that these other forms of diversity already exist, and that trying to protect a lot of that diversity to make sure it still can exist for some future becomes actually quite an important thing. I guess in our own kind of poor way, this is one of the things that's behind the futures, the plurality of futures of design education as well. I just wondered if you want to talk a bit more about that diversity being under attack, not just from an Indian context, but maybe from your own sort of personal experience with what you've been doing.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. I think, I mean, diversity has many facets to it, right? So, I mean, you can go deeper in terms of cultural diversity or religious diversity or even gender diversity, right? So there are so many facets, crafts, communities. There has obviously been this push throughout human history to, for some reason, become like, one or follow the dominant group. It's not just, I would say, I mean, it predates Western colonization as well, right? So this idea of kind of go with the dominant group type of thing. Maybe it's a type of survival of the fittest, or I don't know where it comes from, but there is this urge or instinct somewhere down there. But yeah, I mean, the idea is not necessarily just to preserve diversity, but the idea is how to make diversity flourish. So it's not about putting it in a, pickle jar type of thing, but how do you actually introduce new, so I mean, the idea of Typecraft was really to spark or be a catalyst working with tribal or craft communities as one avenue. I mean, there can be millions of avenues in which we can spark change or new ways of collaboration or new ways of thinking about that particular group of people. So yeah, I mean, as long as it's thriving and it's a living sort of diversity, I would definitely celebrate that. Not the kind of museum, if you know what I mean, preserved diversity.
No, absolutely. Well, I think there's a growing realization that even in some of that preservation, you actually reify, you actually turn diversity into something completely different. It becomes flattened in a certain way.
Yeah.
I just wondered, I mean,
Exactly.
do you have any sense of what the biggest threats are to diversity just now, or do you see more positive practice coming through?
I mean, globalization is a big threat. There's so many threats. The English language in a way is a threat. Our government is a threat. So there are lots of threats to diversity, and there always will be. You know, so that's I guess part of it. But yeah, how do you overcome that, and how do you still manage to persevere, I guess.
Yep. That's interesting. I wonder if...
And I think that's an important, sorry to interrupt.
No, carry on, please. Yeah.
I think it's important for designers and design education to think about diversity, especially in a country like India, where it's not being even discussed or talked about, I would say. We don't get people coming from a tribal village coming and teaching us about their community and their art forms. That could be a class right there, learning from them. So yeah, so it's still very, very nascent in terms of how it can be applied. I think even in a country as diverse as India, it's not happening.
Yep.
So that's the sad part right now. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and yeah, Leslie Ann's commenting that threats are from all over. Leslie Ann, did you want to come in on that at all? Sorry, didn't mean
no, I nothing to say. I just think this has been a fantastic presentation, and I mean, I'm glad that we were able to listen to you, Ishan, and see your presentation. You have sparked so many ideas. I said I wasn't going to say anything, but actually, what I really like about your work is that you are forcing us to think about design in ways that are not about necessarily commercialism. So, the thing of using design to, like what you just said about a community teaching people about their own culture, or that discussion we were starting about the tactile nature of design, and maybe design and literacy, or design and people who are visually impaired, or it's just sending me in all of these different directions, which I'm going to say thank you for all of that.
Well, thank you, Leslie. Yeah, and in fact, to add to what you just said, and to what Derek asked about, when we talk about decolonization, it's not just about Western colonization. I feel India itself is, in a way, colonizing its own tribal communities, its own, marginalized communities. So there's a internal colonization happening by dominant groups, whether it's caste or it's tribe or, all sorts of things, gender. So there is all sorts of colonization happening at various levels. And so when we talk about decolonization, it's all of these things, right? And as many of you have said, threats are from all over. So we have to persevere, we have to fight those threats, and we have to bring it into mainstream design education and at least make it known. I think people are not even at the stage of awareness. A lot of people are just studying as nothing's going on. So this contemporary context is really critical in design. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I like that. That's a slightly different reframe of a kind of like form of sort of critical design. I really like that inflection, Ishan. And just to echo Leslie's comments there, it's been a really fantastic presentation. There's been some really thoughtful, very subtly well thought out ideas presented by yourself, Ishan, and the project and the works and the communities from which that have contributed to that work and created that work. I realize that we're 1 minute past already. I'm so sorry for keeping you so long. Thank you so much for that. Very interesting talk, really interesting issues. I'll post some links in the chat, or I'll post them in the link to the recording for everybody after the session today, to make sure that you can have a look at Ishan's work. But in the meantime, Ishan, thank you so much for that. It really was a really interesting presentation.
Thank you so much, Derek, for having me here, and I'm glad there were such great questions and comments. So thank you, everyone, as well, for your time and for being here. Thanks a lot.
No, at all. Thank you very much. Final reminder that, as I say, the next Futures meetup will be on the 20th of May, not the 15th, as I said earlier, the 20th of May. That'll be Luciana from the New School, Parsons New School. But for today, Ishan, once again, thank you so much. And as I say, I'll share links, and I hope to hear some more of your work at some point in the future. Looking really forward to hearing about the deforestation project in particular. So thank you very much, Ishan, and all the very best. And good luck with the storm.
Great.
Hope it doesn't hit too hard.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks, Derek. Yeah, we're bracing for it. All right, cheers. Metaphorically as well, the future storm, right? But yeah.
Brilliant.
Couldn't help myself. All right, cheers.
Cool. Thank
Thanks
you
a
very
lot,
much.
everyone.